Alright, hello guys, I hope it works. Today is the 30th of October. Right, it shows that it works from all sides. So today is the 30th of October. I've thought to cover this subject for a while. And today we're going to talk about what happens after Russia. So after Ukraine beats Russia in this war, what's gonna happen next? I mean, I covered this before, like for example, when I talked about in my video 2019, I was saying that look, the Russian attack on Ukraine, it will be the last hurrah of the Putin regime. It's just the way they've set themselves up over the years, obviously, but it's kind of, I'm gonna start from this, but it's kind of interesting thing. The last video I have done was about how Ukraine is technologically was a bit more advanced than Russian troops. You know how they used, like obviously in my previous videos I talked about how Ukrainians kind of learned to use better tactics, better strategies to beat the Russian troops when they've actually invaded. For example, at the start of the war, I've made a video like Ukraine won, Russia lost, and the West is no Ukraine won, West is losing, Russia lost, right? You know, where I was talking at length that yes, what is going to happen is that Ukraine is going to win this war, but obviously if the West drags on with their assistance, then it will just take a very long time. It will lead to lots of victims on Ukrainian side. Obviously, I could not foresee that. I knew that things are bad in Russia, but I could not foresee that they will be so horrible to a peaceful population, to civilian population. At the moment, they are already talking about recruiting, basically forcing the people that from the areas that they've captured, forcing them to go into fighting, essentially separating them between different units and making them go fight. They threaten people with nuclear bombs. They've spent their time threatening to explode Chernobyl station. They were bringing in explosives into Zaporizhia station, and they've been heavily involved in the crimes against like civilian population. But in 2019, I have actually said a phrase that like the Russia is like a dead corpse, but which is not quite sure it's dead, but it's kind of like dying there. It's got some stuff happening in there and the gases, and it will be time when it explodes and covers everyone in shit. And that's essentially what's going on. Recently, I compared them to people who got rabies and syphilis at the same time. So my opinion, people know, but oh, YouTube is complaining about something. But talking about this, obviously, last video I've made, I was talking about how Ukraine was technologically a bit more advanced in the technologies they use, so like slightly better tanks, slightly better armored people carriers, slightly better slightly better upgraded planes. So yes, Russians had some newer planes which they've built, so they were still Soviet designs, but they built them already after the fall of Soviet Union. They were building them at like 4 or 5 planes a year. The planes were obviously crashing as well, so not doing very well, but they were still building some planes, and so they managed to keep some during those years, like planes of the generation 4 plus. But it's funny, like I'm having this video on me, so I talked about this channel, but Denis Davidov, alright, the guy who does lots of short videos about events in Ukraine, sometimes a bit maybe too upbeat, but he's obviously happy when good things happen for Ukraine. And that Ukraine is using probably the first country who used overwater drones to attack ships, and they blew up ships in Sevastopol. That's what we're talking, is that new technologies, despite the fact that Ukraine is being under attack, despite the fact that so many areas are being bombed and shelled, and the Russians shoot missiles, Ukrainians still produce drones. There's a new Shark drone. Let me just look it up. Okay. Control new. Shark. Ooh. Yeah. So, perfect Shark drone. So, Shark drone in Ukraine. So, we've got all this happening on there. Okay, it's also interesting that last time I've said that the Ukrainian offensive has happened slightly earlier than originally expected, and here's the quote from the program that's been done by Ukrainian expert. It's been done yesterday, so it's a day after I released my video, and it's like as if he heard my words. He's in there. He said that, look, not from the Ukrainian point of view, from the point of view, he said, look, from the point of view of the West, from the communication, he said it was the West was not expecting the Russia to actually start failing so badly so fast. And the reason for this is that the fact that Russians, to be honest, they were relying on violence, they were relying on people being scared of them, and that didn't happen, and they're failing. They didn't have the technologies. They still don't have the technologies. Even worse than that, they don't have the economics. I mean, talking about the fear factor, again, here's a video, CBS, they have American fighter in Ukraine traumatized by his experience on battlefield. So essentially, this is an American guy who went to Ukraine, and he's seen the way Russians were doing things, and it's like, you understand, you would kind of half expecting people to be kind of civilized, but he was telling about phosphorus bombs. He was obviously telling about going into the villages where he'd seen all the crimes committed by Russian soldiers. It's like, it's not good. And what we're not looking at now is like many people, like for example, this guy obviously, some other people saying that a lot of times West and the world in general are afraid to look at what happens if Russia fails. What happens if Russia loses the war and the regime loses their control over the territories? What is going to happen? Will the regime lose the control over territories, right? And to be honest, this is why I was saying that, look, this is their last hurrah. They will lose the control over territories. That's not a question. Obviously, this is a video, and this is a video by a Russian person. He's like, obviously, the channel goes inside Russia. And this is a Russian, like, he's an economics professor, something like this. He was working in the energy market. And at the moment he's here, he's talking like, again, very similar to me, just like, a guy who's like more of a boring person who talks, he's not talking very fast, he's like really calm and chilled out. And you really need to watch this video to understand what things are going on there, because he goes through, like, for about first 45 minutes of the video, he goes through the situation in Russia from very basic economics point of view, and he's saying, look, the production has fallen by 45%, like this has fallen by 50%, something's fallen by so much percent. He was going like, the use of electricity has been falling by like 4%, and 4% fall of use of electricity is quite much. And he's kind of saying, oh, it's because we're not producing enough. Actually, it is as a result of the Western companies. They have pulled out of Russia, and obviously there's a lot of production in Russia which was essentially, what they're saying, building things with screwdrivers. Essentially, what they were doing is they were like receiving parts from the West, and then they would have the schema and they just put things together in Russia, right? This was just a way to avoid the the border, the border like payment things on the border and things like this. So the Russians had this really high like customs payments and things like this, and to avoid that, the companies were essentially kind of not building cars from scratch, but importing parts and then building cars, or importing parts for the furniture, as in case of IKEA, for example, and then building furniture already in Russia, like you know. And many of these companies have stopped doing this. They have stopped doing a lot of this over like April, May time. But as any civilized company, I actually wrote a comment on here. I don't know. Yeah, it is like you know because this guy was saying that look, I'm surprised that Russian economy has not collapsed in the summer. Like it's probably because they have done it like you know the central bank has done a good job. Well, I was like, look, it's not because the central bank has done a good job. It's literally because many companies, they were creating this, like they live in the market. But obviously, as many civilized people, they still continued paying people wages for like 3 months. So yeah, the economy started to collapse, started to slow down, but there was still money coming in. People were still going out buying things. So, and now it's like that kind of reality kicks in that yes, the last 3 months of wages have finished, and it's like I did mention this situation in one of the other videos I was talking about. When I was talking about the war, I was saying, look, you know, there was a huge push before the mobilization campaign, before they starting to mobilize people. They were actually pushing, they were offering people money to go and fight in Ukraine. And obviously I was saying that, look guys, you know, once that money starts running out, you know, once those wages from the companies, the Western companies themselves, but obviously from the surrounding companies as well, because Russia has lost the access to parts. Russia has lost the access to chips, for example. So a lot of manufacturing has been still running on something they had in storage, you know, but now those things are running out, those parts are running out. Like the Lada car manufacturer in Russia, like they essentially went down and stripped their cars to the most bare like you know, it's like essentially you buying the car as if you would buy it in 1970s. Like they have no safety there, like you know, no airbags, no proper like entertainment system. I don't think they even put a proper radio in anymore because obviously you know they don't have the models. All that is gone. So it's essentially back to you have a set of wheels with a crappy seat and a steering wheel, and it just made to look more modern because the model has been designed in I don't know 2000s. That's it. Right, so lots of production. The trucks have stopped. They stopped producing like better trucks. They're reversing their trucks back to kind of really bad designs of like 1970s. And things like this started happening, but it also means a lot of production from the Western companies have stopped, so people stopped getting wages. The production in the local factories is stopping right now because they're essentially running out of chips, they're running out of parts which they cannot bring in from the West anymore. Even the Chinese going like, look guys, we don't want anything to do with you. And as this guy points out, he says, look, at the moment, like you know, people just in the next few months, people gonna already got enough gas storage, but the new sanctions coming in from limiting the Russia at selling like oil on a certain price. There's obviously like people not, they have blew up the gas lines into Europe, which means that if you look, I've made a video somewhere talking about gas, but okay. Gas fields in Russia. Okay. Right, so if we look at the gas fields, I will take this one. We'll go into images. Right, so we see the major fields. Yeah, so you have those major fields like here, and then you've got fields over the east. So, and major gas fields, was it current conventional oil production? Okay, this is oil, but oil and gas, they go quite similar. Yeah, oil and gas, they go into like similar areas. So essentially, they pump this area. From this area, they pump gas and oil into the Europe, and from this area, they pump gas and oil into Japan, China, Korea, other places. Right. So but they blew up the pipelines into Europe. They also threatened to blow up pipelines going from Sweden and Finland into Europe. They've been caught trying to find the power cables going under the ocean and pipelines going under the ocean floor from between England and Europe and from Africa. So they've been caught trying to snoop around and find places where they can damage the gas supplies. But the main thing for them is that essentially these fields become useless for them. So they get gas and oil to go to China, and Japan, yes, but China and Japan and India also kind of saying, hey, we're kind of getting off, because now that Europe has got enough gas, the gas prices are actually dropping, as far as I know from what I've heard. Somebody was saying that at some point of time the gas prices were actually dropping below zero because people brought in too much liquid gas into Europe, and just to free up the ships, they say, look, you can have it for zero. We're even going to pay you to get some gas, because the storage unit, the gas storage in Europe is actually full, like pretty much 100%. This means that they're gonna start feeling the pinch from not selling enough gas, not getting enough money from gas and oil. Russians have actually started to pissing everybody off around themselves by interfering with the food trade, or grain trade. Russia breaks grain trade agreement. Yes. Yeah, so Russia holds participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Essentially, over the summertime, they had this little deal where they were actually talking about allowing Ukrainians to export their grains through the Black Sea. But now they essentially saying, look, we're not part of that anymore. That obviously going to lead to pissing off lots of people in Africa. This is their way of trying to blackmail the world, is by causing hunger in many countries, by stopping the trade from grain and food from like Ukraine, because they have not produced enough themselves and to sell it. But they're stopping it just to kind of make people go like, yeah, we have to kind of make Ukraine give up. And Ukrainians going like, okay, we're happy to supply food through other routes, but we're not giving up. And the thing is this seriously hits against the Russian regime. And what we see is that, as this gentleman says, right, the economics are falling, right? So it's in a free fall. So in the next couple of months, 2 to 3 months, we'll see a complete collapse of Russian production. We'll see a complete collapse of production of military equipment, literally because they don't get enough chips, and because they're not getting enough money from selling gas and oil, they're not going to have even the money to buy those chips on the black market. We'll also see people freezing Russian money in Europe and other places in the world. But now they're having another problem. And why I'm saying that Russia is going to fail is again, this gentleman, I'm just going to use this one, but obviously there's other people talking about this. He said at least 100,000 men, only men, we're not talking about their wives or their children, have managed to escape Russia from Russia during this mobilization campaign. So they were trying to mobilize 300 people. They managed just over 100,000 already, right? But 700,000 escaped Russia. So they went to Georgia, they went to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, they went to China, some might have gone to Japan, a lot of went to Europe. So it's like wherever they could. The thing is, it's not just them, because this is only happened in this autumn, right? What happened before that is I already know some people who are from Russia and escaped Russia before that. They went, look, this isn't, I'm not agreeing with this, and they have moved out of Russia to Georgia as well and to Europe, saying that, look, this isn't, we're not part of this, we disagree with this war, we're against it, but there's nothing we can do, and they left. And those are the people that are younger generations. So we're not talking people like, even 40 years old, not all of them. More of them are younger generation. There was a story told by another Russian, like he's a YouTuber, but he's also a big businessman, and he's been trying to find ways to at least bring in like normal goods into Russia. And he was like, look, he was traveling to Kazakhstan on the train, and he said, I was in the train with these guys, and when we were crossing the border, and they was opening their bags to show what they're bringing with them, he says, look, these guys are bringing essentially socks and servers. So they have like some basic clothing with them, and then what they have, this big bag they have with them, it's essentially a computer server where they were doing some software project, or where they were working as freelancers, where they were providing services to the people in other countries. These people were going away, the engineers were getting away. So it's like people with high education levels, people who can actually build things, highly skilled laborers, so people who can weld, people who can do mechanics, things like this, under a certain age. So from some of them, obviously, it was very hard to escape to Europe, but they've left to nearby countries, so Georgia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. Again, they don't mind having people like that. So you have a huge loss of population. So we can say that during this war, not just in the matter of how many people they lost, killed and wounded and maimed, like from the actual fighting, which is, I think the Russian losses are killed there over close to 70,000 confirmed kills only. And we cannot say that those 70,000 are all Russians, because they also got people from Donetsk and Lugansk to fight. They conscripted people from Crimea to fight for them, and obviously, as long as I'm concerned, those are not Russians, those are Ukrainians. Many of them have been forced into Russian military. Many of them didn't want to, some of them did not have a choice already. So we having those, but still, like, tens of thousands of people dead, right? Tens of thousands wounded, or having other sort of injuries like mental injuries and stuff like this. Many of those people have gone through, essentially they mentally broken. Let's say the things they do in Ukraine, obviously when they go back to Russia, do you think they're gonna change? But all those things happening, and they're losing and then people also leaving the country. So we can say that so far Russian losses just in male population, and we're not talking like some old people who simply passed away. We're talking like active, young, productive men, plus, this is just men, right, is around 1 million people, right? So it's about just under 1% of the whole country's population. But if we talk about, obviously, this is the most productive 1% of the people who are more capable of growing, of starting new businesses, creating new products, like, you know, trying to do something. Like they were escaping Russia slowly, and now they completely like left all of them with their families, because some of the guys obviously didn't have families, but some of the guys would have girlfriends. You know, some of the guys would have full-fledged families. So some of the guys escaped and now bringing their families along with them. Some of them went together, some of them going separately. We're talking about 1.5 million people essentially gone out of Russia, right? And I've got this article here, and it's by New York Times. And this article is going on about how it's not just in Asia, but long slide looms for world population. Essentially what they're talking here, and this is a subject which has been talked about for a very long time, was the fact that there's not enough people being born, which was more than true for Russia. Like by all means, it was more than true for Russia. They've been losing their population by a huge margin, but because of the over the last about 20 years or so, the average birth rates in the world were actually below restoration levels. And the only reason our population has been growing is because if in the 1970s the average lifespan was like 60 years, right? You know, so people who were born in the 1930s, no, not 1910s, so beginning of the 20th century, right? For many of those people, they were not expecting to survive by 1980, right? You know, and when you got like in the beginning of 2000s, you know, like and you get a guy who lived for 100 years, they were like 1, 2 people, 3 people. They were saying like, I remember there was a video somewhere in England where there was this guy who was born before like certain time, and they were like, oh my God, you know, he passed away. So this is the last one. You know, it was like now our average life expectancy has been growing because some of the medicines were obviously cheaper, like some other things. But in Russia, the population, like overall the age of the population obviously increased. There still have not been as many births, so there's not as many young people. Some older people live longer. I know most of my, like, you know, people I know who's supposed to say like, oh, my grandmother still lives with me, like, you know, and their grandmother is like nearly 90 years old. So of course these things still happen. So the population was growing, but I'm gonna go back to this one. I really like this Russian economy collapsing. But the Russian population has been shrinking, but they can maintain the population by essentially high levels of immigration. So they were claiming to have like 130, 140 million people, but in reality, like over 10 million people, there were people came over from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, because there's areas like, although the countries do have money, but they still have tons of impoverished areas, and many of those people, because they still spoke Russian, they saw the Russia as a more developed market at the time because of the way it was set up, and they would come and work for really small money in the big cities in Russia. So, but they were better money than they were making back home. As a matter of fact, in the 1990s, even some Ukrainians, like many Ukrainians I knew, they were going to work to Moscow as builders because they were making like more money as a builder in Moscow than they used to do in Ukraine. It was like in 2000s that started to change, and many builders in Ukraine actually made good money. Especially like I was talking to people, for example, who would work in Europe but then come back to Ukraine and say, look, you know, the difference in money I was making in Europe and in Ukraine is so negligible that going back to work in Europe does not make sense, because here I have to leave my family, I have to stay away from my children, so for what? For like extra 200 euros a month, but for that I have to live in the shitty conditions, you know, it's like save every penny, and then obviously you have the expenses of staying in Europe, but also you have the expenses to pay in Ukraine. And yeah, if he could keep all the money without the expenses of staying in Europe, maybe it would be worth it, but it wasn't. And many Ukrainians, they stopped going to Europe to make money even in Europe. Same as what happens with Polish people. Same what happens increasingly with people from like Romania, where there used to be lots of people going to work on the farms, but now they are either moving to Europe to leave completely or don't bother going there, right? So these things are happening, but Russia is losing its population by a huge margin. They have lost thousands and thousands of people yearly, but now obviously through this they have lost pretty much one of the most active millions of. So if you take people, they probably have population now, like if all the immigrants moving out as well that happened, we could safely say that their population has fallen by quite a bit. We're talking over 20 million people easily, literally just in immigrants. If we look at the map of Russia, let's look it up. Russia by region. Let's look at this one. Okay, that's a small image. Let's look at images. Right, those are economic regions. Yeah, it's a pretty large map. Yeah, so you see, like, if you look at the regions, so if you look here, right, these regions, many people who live there, like number one, many of these, like for example, Buryatia, this one. So these are not, this is called Buryatia because there's actual ethnicity that is living there who are not Russians. So many of these regions are not actually like Yakutia, which is like very small population. So this region here, all right, this is very small population, and again, this very few, like even we're not gonna call them Russians, we're gonna call them Slavs living there. So there's a particular nationality living there. Many of these regions here as well, so it's like they would have like their own actually small nationalities living here. So if we go to control pause, there's Chechnya somewhere here, like there's a small bunch of other small country like nationalities here, like Dagestan, and all those guys staying there. It's like all little regions. Many of them are actually not populated by Russians. For example, this area as well has got a very big Chinese population. We're talking like again over few millions of Chinese essentially living there and representing China, and they are like cutting off. They're working in many Chinese enterprises. Half of them are half legal, many of them completely destructive to the surroundings. Like we're talking like cutting off forests to the point where it's just used to be what used to be a huge forest now became like essentially a plain land you can start planting there. Like, so many of those places they have small nationalities, but they also have like people say moving in there from China, for example, millions of people. So when they say, hey, we have 130 million, well, there's a lot of people who are not actually like even citizens of Russian Federation, but because they live there, they're considered like part of the population. So, but we'll see that one is falling. So, once we looked at the situation, obviously we understand now that yes, the economics are gonna fall. Many of these people who walked into like some national, like some local enterprises, who will be losing now, because they have lost access to the international markets, they will not be able to like to exist. They will not be able to produce their produce. They will not be able to, I don't know, fix things. So if it's a garage, you know, it has to fix cars, okay, maybe they can find some ways around. But if it's something like serious, like fixing computers, for example, well, okay, you can probably solder something on or off the old parts and maybe see if you can save the computers like this. But obviously, over time, those businesses are going to start going out of business. People are going to start getting increasingly unhappy, and the Moscow has nothing to control them with, right? Because what people talk about usually is they say, hey, Russia has got like 1 million people in their army and military. Like, yes, we've seen them in Ukraine and they failed spectacularly. Like, you know, they've done. Number one is that the way Russians can count their military is very different from the way many people count their military around the world. So, for example, if in US and in UK, when they say our military is such and such, this means that their military is such and such. But if they have to build barracks for the military, they will hire a private person, a civilian person, who will go in and build barracks for the military, right? Similar things they started doing in Ukraine just a few years ago. Whereas in Russia, if they need to build barracks for the military, there will be a military building service, right? And it will be considered part of the military. People who will go and build barracks, right? Or build like, they're not like engineering troops in this case of actual military engineering troops, people who can like set up a small bridge. There are those as well, but those are part of the military which cares about like building buildings or something like this. People who cook for the military, in most of the countries, those are civilians which have been hired to do the cooking. So they do the same in Ukraine. I worked in an American military base, and people who did the cooking, who would go to Afghanistan, for example, they're saying, hey, we're getting prepared to like go somewhere to cook for the I met some guys and said, like, oh, we're going to cook. We're not the military, but we're in this base because of this and this, and we're going somewhere to do some job for the military, but we're the civilians. So in Russia, many people, when they talk about 1 million people in the military, they have to understand that out of this 1 million people, the amount of people who have any relationship towards actual military fighting, towards actually being like, you know, going to Ukraine or something like this number is probably 1/3 of the whole number of the military, right? So that part has to be considered, right? Also the fact that a lot of people that are, then people will say, but they have the internal troops, but the internal troops, they're essentially police forces which has been trained. They have not been trained in combat. They have been trained to essentially beat people up. So the internal forces are quite often the guys you see that when there is a protest in Moscow, there comes in a whole bunch of guys who are probably fatter than me, but they have this kind of bulletproof vest that only covers like a little area of their stomach. Right, and they come in and they beat up kids on the streets. That's that military, right? They're not military units. They're just a bunch of cons who get paid to be aggressive towards like civilian peaceful population. Yes, there is about 1 million of those guys, but for the country which has still got over 100 million population, much of that population is not really like, you know, even like Russian. I mean, people from Chechnya, many of them speak such a bad. They speak, and in Chechnya they speak the Chechen language. In Dagestan they have their own language. There's difference between them. I'm not an expert. I don't want to start naming what's the name of that language or the other language. Right? They have their own rules. They have their own customs. They have their own laws quite often. Right? But those guys, those internal troops, they're essentially there to beat up and scare peaceful civilian population into submission. And the problem now is, as I pointed out, as their economics crash, as the factories start to close, as enterprises start to close, as the small shops start to close. So just to give you an example, when the Western brands, clothing brands, were coming out of Russian market in April, May time. There's a video I came across of somebody saying, but look, we have this shop here, and now they have brought in Russian clothing brands. Like half of them were clothes from China, actually. Right? But even the Russian clothing brands and like crappy Chinese brands, like not good ones, right? They were charging a lot more for the clothes than the branded brands were. So like, you go like the same thing you'd get from like, I don't know, whichever, like M&S or whatever brand, like, not overly expensive but reasonably good quality brands in Europe, right? The similar clothes in the way they look but not as good quality would be charged nearly double for, like, in Russia. And if we go back down to this guy, right, in his video, you can watch this, it's in English, like it's quite watered, but he was saying that the people buying things have dropped, the amount of things people will consume, the consumption has dropped significantly. And the reason for that even though that the Russians in Russia, like the Russian ruble kind of rose in price, so you'd think you can buy more, but in reality lots of goods that used to be costing like not as much grew up in price. So the clothes grew up in price. The McDonald's have left the country, but they said, look, we're gonna do a nice thing, and we're gonna sell this brand to this guy, and he can do whatever he wants with that. And people were saying, look, yeah, he can, but he has turned it into a shitty place, like bad quality, because they try and to cut corners where the McDonald's didn't used to, and it was more expensive there than the original McDonald's. So like where the portion of chips were costing them like, I don't know, 50 rubles, 60 rubles at first in Russia, like, now it was costing them 120 rubles, but it was shit chips. If the burger was costing them, I don't know, 100 rubles, now it was costing them 150, 160 rubles, and it was tasting like as if it's been just baked out of the trash bin. As these things started happening, so people obviously start consuming less because the prices have grown up. So yeah, many outside towns, they still consume some local produce. Obviously that still existed, but obviously this starts to have a compound impact. And like I mentioned in the start of this video, what I said was that the Russians were the companies that fully left the market, like IKEA, they were still paying the wages. But the knock-on effect of IKEA leaving the Russian market was that, for example, the big IKEA shops were closing in the big shopping centers, right? And because people used to go to IKEA, so they would go to IKEA to buy some things, then the shops were bringing traffic to the shopping centers. But now the traffic was gone because people didn't go there. There was no IKEA, and to be honest, most of the things people would buy from the shopping center, they could buy somewhere near them, and the shopping center was essentially going out of business. And it lasted for months, but more shops would close. The cinemas would not get the visitors because less people come into the shopping center because there's no IKEA, there's no that shop, no that shop, and that had overall knock-on effect over the next few months, which is we see now. The prices going up, the wages either stagnating or disappearing completely, and in many of those areas, and we're talking also about Moscow, we're not talking just about like some town in the middle of nowhere, but the knock-on effect of all this is finally starting to show. Right? The economy has gone into free dive, many companies closing down, obviously they're using up less energy because the companies are closing down, right? So that's how it goes. And what happens next? Well, the Russian government is going to lose control. So all the attempts to threaten Ukraine or anything else, by the end of winter, I would say, right? By the end of winter, they're going to lose control. They are going to lose this war, right? They don't have the tools to win it with. They're sending in like another 100,000 of soldiers. Yes, they can threaten it. They can do a lot more damage to Ukraine, but this war they have lost. And what comes with that is that many people gonna start asking like, look, you have left us in the field, right? That we have no production, we have no produce that we can use, like we cannot use internet anymore. Again, interesting conversation I was having with somebody I know who's from Russia, and I said to them, look, something I mentioned in my previous videos as well, I was saying, look, lots of people in Russia do not have access, or at least proper access to the internet. And when they do, they're only limited to like certain areas. And he was like, what do you mean they can have access to the internet whenever they want, because we have this mobile internet available almost everywhere. Like you can go somewhere in the middle of Siberia and you still probably find some internet provider. And I was like going, look, it's not that. It's like, yeah, you can, maybe you still need to buy that phone that will give you good access to the internet. And many people cannot afford to buy a $50 phone. Right? So it's like, oh yeah, okay, cool. So it means that they don't have access. Even if they can buy this $50 phone, let's be honest, like how many of us is gonna spend hours and hours browsing the internet on the phone? Not many. So then you have to have a know-how how to connect that phone, that mobile internet to your computer, right? It's great if you have a computer, right? I have a couple knocking about. Those guys cannot afford, they got a phone, but they cannot afford a computer to connect it to, right? So it's, again, you see these people losing even that. Like, even if they have internet on their phone, they'll be losing even that. Why? Because there's no parts to replace on the mobile towers as things go sideways, right? There's no parts to replace on the servers as the servers die. So that is going to go out. And more people are going to start losing the connection with the center. They're going to start moving away from the center towards their local news. And their local news is quite often, as been pointed out by one of the actually Russian commentators, he's done it in Russian. It came on my YouTube channel, on my YouTube selection. And this guy was saying like, look, these are the local news and these are the central news. And the local news are very, very, very different from the central news. In the central news, they do not show these things that they show in the local news. But this also means that the people who look at the local news, as things start changing, as they start losing the connection with the center, the local news are going to change. And let's go back to the map of Russia, right? You see how many different areas they have in there? And sure, some of these areas are going to be happy to stay as part of the Moscow, kind of area. But let's look at what's going to happen. Well, number one, many of those areas have been losing a lot of money in taxes to Moscow. So this gives them an incentive to actually get out of Russia, right? To become independent. Like many of these areas, they'll have either good resources as, for example, forest like wood that they can sell, and many other things like many things you can dig out from the ground to sell, but now they can sell them and keep the money for themselves. Now many of these areas, they have population of like, I don't know, 20,000 people. So the 20,000 people selling like, I don't know, 10 20 million worth of forest every year, is they don't have to worry about shit, right? So they're very much enticed to choose their own independence. Like, look, if we go here, like, yes, it's hard to trade here because this is like an ice ocean half the year, but half the year the ships can go through there. From here, they can sell here, like from Yakutia. There's plenty of forest there. There's plenty of connections by rivers to China, to Mongolia, which Mongolia doesn't have a lot of forest, for example. They actually need a lot of this stuff. They have many of these areas, they have oil, they have some version of gas, they have some back pipelines. But if they sell those goods, right, and they have like such a low population there, we're talking like, I think somewhere near Mongolia, like this whole area, outside, if you don't look at the cities, outside the cities, the population there is like one person for like 100 square kilometers. Like 100 square kilometers, that's like, 20 Berlins or something like this. Like, Berlin is like 20, 30 square kilometers. Like, that's 3, 4, 5 Berlins. There's only one person living there, right? We don't. People in Europe don't get this. Is like where you can live somewhere there and you would not see anybody coming your way for a year. Like, you can be in the village which does not even have a road connection to anywhere. Like, you have to walk from there to the town for a few days. Right, so we have these big areas in here which have very low population. Right, many areas in here. So, for example, Chechnya. Many people heard about Ramzan Kadyrov and Dagestan. There, those guys, they were at each other's throat for a very long time. But also, those are the areas which have their own oil. And the only reason Chechnya, for example, is doing so fine in Russia is because this is the only part of Russia, the only region in Russia which is getting most of the taxes that they get from selling oil. Most of those taxes are going back into Chechnya. Many of those areas in here, like, they have coal here, gas, shale gas and coal in these areas. This Chechnya somewhere here, Dagestan, they have again shale gas and oil there. Many of these areas, like the coal places, were all shut down in those areas. Like, people have lost tons of jobs. Like, they've been slowly replacing those jobs with someone. Obviously, many of those people have by now passed away or have gone retired, and they have the basic minimum pension from the Russian government. But a lot of taxes that people pay there, they end up in Moscow. So they'd have a company, and the company would have the main office in Moscow, and they pay not all, but most of their taxes in Moscow. So this is why there's so much money in Moscow, but not so much money in Krasnodar and Rostov-na-Don. This is near Ukraine. Now you have to remember that these areas, so if we're gonna go here, right, they don't show like, so Azov Sea areas, like Crimea area. This area, for example, most of the people who lived there for a very long time, those were Ukrainians. Those were Cossacks that moved there at some point of time. Then there was more people coming there from Ukraine during the revolution. As a matter of fact, we're gonna look 1917 Ukraine map. Right. there's somewhat, yeah, there is. 95. Right, so this is a Ukraine map which has been kept somewhere in the 1919, right? So this shows like these many of these areas were considering themselves to be part of Ukraine. Alright, there's a couple of different ones. So this is like, obviously some of the areas have changed, but during the like Russian Revolution, many of these areas were claiming to be part of Ukraine. So for example, Crimean have actually written to Ukrainian government at the time saying that yeah, we are part of Ukraine, we want to be under Ukraine, but then things obviously started changing. There was lots of war happening around, right? So again, this is like, yeah, 1919 year, right? There's many also in those regions, there's many people who have different nationalities. So even though that even the many in many areas where people are Russian, they will prefer to be away from Moscow, because the Moscow is essentially sucking those regions dry. All the oil money, all the gas money, all the natural resources that's being removed out of those places. There's nothing being created. There's very little like big businesses that can actually form the cities. Many factories going out of business, and many of those places they essentially live in of like very very poor lifestyle. Like when you go to Moscow, when you go to St. Petersburg, even like Novgorod here, like the people who live closer to Europe live a little bit better, but not as well as people who live in Moscow and things like this. So we'll see many people saying, hey, we want our own independence. We will also see the part, for example, here, those regions, so Khabarovsky Krai, we go these areas, right? Yuzhno-Sakhalinsky, like Primorsky Krai, these areas, for example, they have very close connections with Japan, right? So this is something to consider, is that these areas have more trade with Japan. So we finally got to the point was like Russia lost the war. Okay, we agree with that. Russia lost the war. What happens next is we're gonna take a look at history. Okay, sorry if I'm a bit confusing, but we're gonna look at history and we say Russians have lost the war. What happens next? Well, what happens next is what's happened before, right? In what happened before is the last Russian Tsar was killed, was dethroned. Who? So yeah. Oh, who is? Yeah, dear February. Yeah, so basically the last Russian Tsar was made to abdicate by his own generals. Okay? So right, so his generals got on his train, put a gun to his head, and they said, okay, you're gonna abdicate. And they broke all the rules of abdication, because he had to abdicate towards his son, but he abdicated towards his brother Mikhail Romanov, and that guy actually went off and gave the power to the revolutionaries, and this is before Bolsheviks. Okay, right? Because many people kind of, especially in Ukrainians, have seen that, oh yeah, it was the troops that didn't want to go to war that have dethroned the Tsar. No, it wasn't the troops, it was the generals because the Nikolai II, he was a crazy motherfucker. Right? He's done lots of stupid stuff. It's like essentially he was like Putin. Like he was destroying Russia. Before this, after the war with Japan, they were actually talking. This is like how the history repeats itself. Is that during after the war with Japan, they were talking about giving spears to Russian soldiers because they could not produce enough guns and they couldn't afford to buy enough guns. Does it sound familiar to what's happening now? Where they don't have guns to give to people that they have mobilized, they have sent people, they actually threaten them with jail time, they force them to go to army, and now they don't have the arms to give to those guys. They have to restore the tanks, not T-62s, like tanks that have been in storage for 50 years plus, and they have to restore to put them back in service because they don't have tanks, they don't have the technology to make the T-72s at least to the level which they had before they invaded Ukraine. They have lost, so the history repeats itself. Now, the guys in Kremlin, I believe they understand that because recently they have been pushing against the military generals. So somebody was fired, somebody has problems with this. So essentially they're trying to move them away from power so that the new king, the new Tsar, is not made to abdicate. The problem is they losing the power to do so. And as soon as Russia loses this war, and as soon as the soldiers go back to Russia, the ones that survived the war in Ukraine, they will give the generals the power, especially the generals that have at least some political weight, to essentially tell the Tsar to fuck off. Right? So that was gonna happen. Once Russia loses the war, the next thing that happens is the Tsar gets killed. Right? If you learn the history about the actual revolution in Russia, there's been a lot of things going on, and even the white movement did not want to put Nikolai II, the last full-blown Tsar of Russia, back on his throne. Right, so the same thing's gonna happen here. Right, the Tsar is gonna be gone. He's gonna be overthrown by his own generals and by the generals who will have the military power. The thing what will happen next is this: not really any people who can unite, and what we see now is many areas they're already they getting the soldiers in, but they're not sending them towards the main troops. So many regions they're starting to build their own troops. For example, in Chechnya and Dagestan and a couple of republics over down south of Russia, they were saying, hey guys, we have sent enough troops already, our troops have volunteered, so now we're not going to be sending our new soldiers to fight in Ukraine. Right, so we see this happening. So things are going to go to shit. Once the Moscow loses power, many of these regions are going to start claiming their own independence, their own government. The infighting is going to start. So similar things that the Russians have instigated, for example, between the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, for example, that was a war many people believe has been the flames of this war have been supported by Russians. They've been pushing for back and forth, which have recently played out again. Right, we know about the things which happened between Pridnestrovia and Moldova, for example. Again, the Russians have been pushing this one, like they keep the conflict going. And now this is gonna come back into Russia. But it's gonna come back into Russia with lots of soldiers that come out of Ukraine, and now they're gonna be going back home, and they're gonna be wanting nothing to do with the center. They'll be trying to they're going to have their local commanders building their local forces, claiming their independence, and bloodshed is gonna start. So, guys, we're gonna see a lot of that coming out of Russia. So, something that I said before, that we are gonna be actually accepting refugees coming from Russia, women and children that will be running from Russia, even in Ukraine. We're not talking even about Belarus and Europe or any other countries around those areas, because the next set of refugees are not going to be guys with computer service. These are going to be women and children running from rapes, running from fighting, running from violence, running from this independence war by many of these regions. And to be honest, I don't see that the center is going to be capable of keeping the rest of all these areas connected to the center, because let's be honest, from this line onwards, not even this one, not even here, but from about this line onwards, you see this yellow, red, blue, this kind of onwards, many of these areas have less connections to the center of Russia than they do, for example, to Kazakhstan, or to Mongolia, or to China, or to Japan. This is what we're going to see change. So many of these areas, they're going to probably declare their independence, but nobody's going to even bother with them because they're just so far out. There's almost no civilization in there. Yes, there are like some like resources you can get out of there, but many of these areas probably going to be like visited by international corporations, and there's going to be like some sort of industries created there, but it's not, these areas probably just going to disappear from the map of Russia, peacefully become their own countries. They're probably going to lose in area a little bit, because many of them simply don't have the troops to protect it all. So there'll be like an area on the map, but it's going to be just kind of a place where anybody goes, everybody comes back, whatever. But we're going to see these areas, like from here onwards to here, many of them are going to become part of the Chinese, maybe not the own country, not full on China, but this kind of Chinese Union, where they will be claiming they're part of this kind of Great China. But the thing is that China has lots of own problems, and because the Chinese population is generally based around kind of south area near the sea, closer towards the sea area kind of thing, they're not gonna have as much Chinese population moving there, so they will not be kind of, even if they claim that this become part of the China, because there's a lot of Chinese living there, I don't think this thing is gonna be like made by force, but it will become like, oh, part of the Chinese protectorate or something like this. And the Chinese already getting lots of resources from this area. And for example, Amurska Oblast, they were claiming that this was part of the China for a long ago, and then they lost it because of Russians betraying them at one point or the other. But this Chitinskaya Oblast, Buryatia, these areas probably gonna end up kind of joining, kind of being between Russia and Mongolia, being a source of natural resources against Irkutskaya Oblast. These areas are gonna become kind of start selling their resources. So, but there's not much connections there. So to the centers, like one or two roads, one railway, but these areas have pipelines from here into China and into Japan, selling oil and natural gas. So they will have some influx of money. Obviously they have similar, probably something smaller to Mongolia, and they be selling it to India. So, but I don't think Chinese have the manpower to capture them, but it will be more of a like bigger Chinese trading bloc. I think if the Chinese government is at least half intelligent, with the problems they have at the moment and with their own economic problems that they have and will have in the near 50, 60 to 60 years, considering how badly they fucked up on their economics. What they will do is they will have this kind of peaceful takeover where these guys will have like their own governments, their own ways of doing business, but the Chinese will be like investing into them heavily, bringing companies and making it like a peaceful takeover which will last for 100 to 200 years. That's how it's gonna happen if the China lasts that long. These areas, like I said, like these areas, this purple, blue, these areas here, they have such a close connection to Japan. Like, so this Okhotskaya Moре, for example, this area, they have good ports in there as well, good trading ports. So the Chinese might try and get in there, but Chinese have got their own ports, and like we said, they don't have the population and, to be honest, the technology and skills to build up those areas and to assimilate those areas. But those areas have close connections with Japan. They actually in some cities in those areas, I don't know, like Vladivostok, I don't know if it shows Sakhalin as well. It doesn't show those, but in some cities over there, they still drive Japanese cars. So essentially, they drive like for the left hand on they drive on the right hand side. So they should have their wheel, as all in Russia do, they should have their wheel on the left, like they do in Europe. But they actually drive Japanese cars, so they drive right wheel drive, right hand drive cars. So with the steering wheel on the right. They have been trading with Japan for a very long time. They've been trading with Japanese fishermen for a very long time. They've been, like, you know, walking on the Japanese boats as well, like many people would live in Japan for a while. So many of those areas are very likely to become part of Japan. And again, it's not gonna be a military kind of takeover of Japan, but they just gravitate toward Japan and probably become like part of the bigger Japanese trading union. Some of them might say we're independent because we want to be like still continue having our pride as we used to be part of this great empire, which has been like 10 times bigger than Japan. But what I suspect might happen is there's going to be a lot of big exchange of populations between those areas here and Japan, same as those areas here and China, because another thing that happens is that China and Japan are the two countries which have got big problems with their population. And where's this article? Yeah, you see this one, the population problems we have, they're more visible in China and Japan, and they really need those areas, not even for the resources, not even for the, like, you know, some business trades. I do apologize, but they really need those areas for population. Like, there's a big problem in China because they have more men than women, and Russia at the moment has more women than men. As a matter of fact, there were quite a few unions, like where the Chinese guys were coming over as part of the company, like chopping wood somewhere in Russia, and then they were marrying Russian women because there's not enough guys in many Russian villages, with the many guys taken out over to fight in the war, that they took out the most productive part of the populations from those areas. There's a huge problem with alcoholism in those areas as well, so many guys drink themselves to death. There's been stories where some guy was old guy was started like sleeping with the grandma, and then he ended up sleeping with the mother, and then even with the granddaughter. Like, you know, the whole three generations of women sleeping with the same guy because that was the only guy there, right? Obviously, those are extremes, but those areas are full of women like who would be happy to have relationships with the Chinese guys. They're happy of the more younger population because Japan now have problems with the aging population. So like there's younger populations in those areas. But also these areas, they give, for example, in Japan, the problem is the living space. So like, you know, having the cities which are there, which can be simply repaired and brought to normal standards, allowing to smooth out business from the main Japanese areas, like, you know, so you're not as forced to leave, for example, run your business from Tokyo, because you can run it from Vladivostok, and the Vladivostok has got the big airport, it has a big port, so you can run your business from there as part of Japan. It makes sense, and as well, it's like, you know, you don't need to capture it. It can be like more of a union which is created over time. These are the ideas to look at and check out. So obviously, I'm not saying this is gonna happen within like first few months, but this is, from my point of view, is the most logical things to happen. Now these areas here, like, they have obviously lots of resources, but I'm not sure how they're gonna get divided because there's like almost no population there. Nobody wants to live there. There's not many roads. A lot of stuff done by helicopters. I'm not gonna be surprised that many of these areas are gonna be given up to Americans. You know, the Japanese will say like, yeah, you know, we kind of like our civilization. The Chinese gonna have, well, we captured this area, but again, they say the problem they have is that a lot of Chinese live in the south. Not many people want to live in the north. You know, it's a very poor population in the north. They might be enticed to move into these areas because, again, they're quite good for living, but it also means that these areas are very continental climates. So quite nice warm summers, but really fucking cold winters. Right, so like same as Mongolia, for example, they have nice summers, but really fucking cold winters. Like, so these areas, we're probably gonna see them becoming like kind of business hubs with small population, small but rich population, because they do have a lot of natural resources. I mean, probably that will draw people to move in there, but it's a lot of work to actually make those areas livable because they're in a colder part of climate, right? Okay, like probably similar to Sweden, Norway, Finland kind of area in their climate ways. There's almost no roads. It has to be built all from scratch. But on the other hand, these areas could become something that is actually used as an example how to build the next generation kind of infrastructure. Unlike what they've done in China, where they've built a lot of ghost cities because people were just buying those flats as an investment, and the builders were building them and not even finishing them, and then the builders went out of business because of unhappy business practices. But as we go closer to the center, now here the things are starting to get more complicated, right? Because it's obviously many areas around here might be kind of, they will fight their like way away from the center, and probably even gonna walk towards kind of working closer with Kazakhstan and closer, because these areas, they might have some natural resources. But to be honest, this is where a lot of fighting gonna happen, as it happened in beginning of the 20th century. like because these are the areas they're starting to get reasonably well populated, but there's also lots of small, like mix of small different groups of people. Somebody wants this, somebody wants that. And I was reading the book about the times of the start of the 20th century, and they were saying like there will be like one big region, but then it would be divided into 4 different countries. And the 4 different countries, there will be only one train station, and there will be a train standing, which would be like part of the train would be like to this country, this train would be to this country, this train would be belong to this country, and this train would like so like 4 trains, and they would be like essentially representing the 4 countries, and their governments will advise like, and then these countries will have a little war in between themselves. So over time, these areas will obviously kind of unite into a bit bigger areas together, more centralized governments, but this is where lots of fighting will be. Some of the areas might still gravitate towards Moscow, simply as part of their restructuring. I'm not sure how they were going to do it, but this is a heavy part. But many areas, for example, here might actually gravitate towards Ukraine, because there's a lot of people living here which are actually, they speak Ukrainian language, and it was always funny. For example, the people who call, like, you know, the actual Cossacks, not the clowns that dress up as Cossacks, but the actual Cossacks in there, and they were saying like, they were very adamant that they're not speaking Ukrainian, because they're saying, well, we're part of Russia, so this is just a Russian dialect, while speaking actual Ukrainian. So we'll see that there will be some fighting, but to be honest, with the mass in there, many people in there might gravitate towards Ukraine as as part of the kind of cultural connection. But also many of these areas, they have, like I said, coal, they have a shale gas and things like this, and these are the parts which are actually very, very required in Ukraine. Right? Ukraine have kept a lot of industries which are connected to having coal, which are connected to having that shale gas. Like, obviously you having access with the technologies to access that shale gas. Ukraine has the pipelines. There are pipelines that used to go from Ukraine to here when they used to dig up oil and gas from Ukraine, but there's also pipelines which go from like Chechnya, from Grozny and these areas, who also getting oil and gas from their own like little basins, and these pipelines are being used. So these kind of areas, instead of fighting, I think they might gravitate towards Ukraine, literally because Ukraine is because Ukraine is already part of the West, but the cultural connection there and the industrial connections, that they were crashed during the Soviet Union falling apart. But there's many enterprises who would actually do better with having connections with plenty of Ukrainian enterprises and having access to the Ukrainian pool of people and experts, right? So, but these areas here, many of these places might actually, like for example, St. Petersburg and like these Murmansk and Arhangelsk, these areas, these guys might actually fuck off to Finland, like, because again, they already have close connections to Finland. So Finns quite often go drinking in St. Petersburg or Murmansk or in Estonia, so like many of these areas might actually choose to kind of join together towards Estonia or Latvia. Not sure how they're gonna do it, but they have a very good source of like saying, hey, you know, we don't want to have anything to do with Moscow, because these are not hyper rich areas, but they do have more connections with Latvia, Estonia, and because obviously this gives them access to the ports of Latvia and Estonia, right? These areas, they have their own little ports. They're not very super good. They don't have like deep sea ports as much as I think one in Latvia, one in Estonia. Like I say, they are closer connected to Finland than they are with Estonia, for example. So they already have close connections, cultural connections. I mean, they fought a war over some land near St. Petersburg as well. So during Second World War, like Karelia Republic. So you see, these areas, they have common border with Finland. So these is again for them it makes more sense to become part of Finland. Obviously, have access to the European style of life, European markets, rather than trying to go back to Moscow, which is essentially incompetent. Like, I know how to go. I mean, right? Basically, these are the guys who can't even have a hard-on. Some of the areas like here might join Belarus. Again, very similar kind of culture-wise. So for them and Belarus, what will happen with Belarus? There will be some big changes there, I guess. So the regime in Belarus is gonna fall, but I think it's gonna be as bloody as the fall of the regime in Russia, because one good thing that the Belarus president has done, he did keep things together. He did keep shit together. He did manage to sit on multiple chairs and keep his country together. Again, they have some interesting industries in there. Things has been developing in there. So, like, unlike Russia, who had to buy drones from Iran, Belarus has got some really basic industries, but they work. And obviously, some of these areas might be more enticed to join Belarus because it's a bigger state. It's more peaceful. They kept their military. And once the Belarus gets rid of their president, the system is still in order, so it will be more peaceful. And I don't think the people of Belarus want to disintegrate their country. They want to get away from their capital. No, they're actually quite happy to be part of one country. So people from here, like Smolensk, Kaluga, Bryansk, right, they might actually be very much enticed to join the Belarus. And again, so now Belarus is going onto the borders of Moscow, but obviously many troops will be fighting for their own piece of land, and Belarus troops are all in order. Yes, they didn't have as much fighting experience, but they still have good tanks, they still have good planes, they still have some ammunitions left, and they will probably the first order of business will be like, hey guys, we're happy to join whoever, just please come and put your troops in here, just because the shitstorm that is happening in Russia, right? So the Moscow is very likely to keep this area for itself, but many of these areas are gonna be going their own separate ways. I say there's just too much connections. Like, for example, if you go from here, there's a gas pipes and things like these going into Europe. Again, like, people can get these small areas might not want to join Moscow, because if they get profit from gas pipes going through their land, they keep those profits. And whatever small enterprises they have there, they can invest into them. Whereas Moscow, if they stay part of Moscow, with Moscow being the capital, they will continue sucking the resources out of these areas. And these areas here, like the central Russia, I suspect is going to be maybe a couple of different republics. Again, it depends, because they have like big natural gas and oil reserves. Obviously, they're a bit old. The technology, they're still old, but they still produce them. And again, it's a question of money, and the question of, I think a Russian commentator have said this, the question is to the government, who the fuck are you? What are you, the governments? Like, this is the question the government's struggling to answer in the West. and the Russian government cannot answer this question whatsoever. So we'll see a couple of, over time, we'll see a couple of republics, because there's a kind of areas which are a bit more different nationalities, more run by people from other nationalities than Russians. But some of these places are kind of will unite based on Russia being like, you know, that kind of idea that we are Russians, right? And Moscow, they're not gonna like it very much, because again, many areas in Russia, so many people go like, I was talking to somebody from guys from, I think it's Ulyanovsk, this little town here. Let me just, right, so from this town here, it's not a little town, it's a regional center. Where he was saying like, you know, when I was telling him, I was like, oh, I know this place, I've heard about it, it's kind of somewhere, like, he was like, oh my god, you're from Ukraine and you know about us. Many people in Russia think it's a village in the middle of nowhere. Okay, they don't even know it exists. So see, you hear this Tatarstan, Kazan, that's like, you know, Tatars living there, so it's not as full of Russian population. So it's like this, so this area is gonna kind of fall apart into a couple of smaller republics, which are kind of based on the nationality kind of way of things. So we'll see the changes of borders here. Hopefully, like I say, it's not going to be as bloody, but it's going to be bloody, right? Because there's going to be lots of people that's going to come back from Ukraine who used to fighting. We're going to see a rise of criminality, similar way we've seen in during the fall of Soviet Union in the 1990s. A lot of criminality has been, the guys who were doing lots of crimes, they were the guys who served and fought in Afghanistan, and they came back from Afghanistan, and then they gathered into the gangs, and they basically doing some crime. Not petty crime, but we're talking like murders, we're talking about forcing businesses to do things like capturing businesses, like lots of like really bad stuff. But we will see that Ufa, this is Bashkortostan again, this is Ufa, this is a very different nationality than Tatarstan, and very different nationality than some other areas. So we'll see this kind of national division of some republics in there. Right, this is going to be the bloodiest area, like not even Moscow, but this is going to be probably the bloodiest area of them all. There's going to be lots of blood in here as well, because these are like lots of little nations, but they have been like at each other's throat. The only thing that kept them from each other's, from essentially trying to kill each other, is the part where they were part of Russia. And obviously some of these areas might actually, this is something to say, is go off to Georgia, because they used to be part of Georgia, but the Georgia is at the moment is way more successful than Russia. So many of this area might be very willing to join Georgia, literally because down the fact that again it allows them to use those connections that Georgia has already built up over the years towards the Western world, but to be honest, towards their neighbors. So there's like Turkey there, Armenia, Azerbaijan, but also like Caspian Sea, like, you know, many of these areas might be actually very likely to Georgia, just to get access to not resources but opportunities of somebody who has already been implementing into the world economy. And Georgia has really managed to create a system. It's not perfect, but it works, and it gets them places in the world which allows them better trade, better quality of life. You know, many people that were running away from Russia, they ran from Georgia literally because of the way of life in there. It's a very nice, very friendly country, not super rich, but place to live, and they're developing in a very kind of steady manner and moving towards the Western style of life. So I think I've covered it all. Like I say, this is my attempt of doing an overview of the what will happen, why Russia will fall, so what to expect. Like I say, I'm pretty sure most of the people will never watch to this point of time. I know I'm pretty boring. I know this all is a lot of like conjecture here, so it's like, a lot of things that I think will happen. It was actually nice to put it in video, put it in somewhere where, like, okay, we'll see what happens. But it's also, the world needs to start talking about things like this. World needs to be seeing things like this, and it needs to kind of go out there and become. So hopefully that when I'm saying that, hey, these guys gonna go to China, these guys are gonna unite. So for example, Nizhny Novgorod, Ivanovo, Vladimir, Kostroma, right? These guys gonna unite together as one republic, probably choosing Nizhny Novgorod as the new capital, right? They're gonna do it peacefully, like, when these areas gonna say, hey, we want our own republic, or like, so for example, Belgorod, Tambov, these areas. Again, this is where the gas pipes are going. So these areas, if they don't fight, I hope they unite peacefully. Maybe they even become part of that kind of close to Nizhny Novgorod. They will probably want to stay away from Moscow, so we'll see the fall of Moscow. It will just become a little thing in the center, like a little city-state kind of ish. So we'll see that the population of Moscow is gonna fall, so we're gonna see a big ghost city over there, where people just gonna live in some areas, right? But by talking of this, like, I understand that they're, like, they will be fighting, but by talking about things like this, what I'm hoping for, it's crazy, right? Is that they won't be fighting. What I'm hoping for, that even if there is a fighting, there's just very little fighting, and then these guys these ideas become more widespread, even if not through me, but through other people talking about this. And maybe when the time comes, by the end of the winter, when the Kremlin falls, when the time comes, these ideas already going to be there. People already gonna start looking at this. Okay, yeah, we can connect here, like, Bashkortostan can connect with Tatarstan, yeah, and become part of the same area. Like, they can closely be connected to Kazakhstan. Chelyabinsk, again, this is mostly Russian area, yes, okay, but they can kind of connect with this Permskaya Oblast, Yekaterinburg, Sverdlovskaya Oblast, like, these guys can unite as one without having to fight as somebody from, for example, Kurgan or other place. So these places can already, that there are the ideas out there, which mean that when these things are happening, people already talk about those ideas, people already discuss those ideas, and when it happens, when the Russia does go to shit, which it will, right, it does not happen through millions and millions and millions of people dying in the infighting, in the famines, from people not getting enough food, simply not being able to deliver food to those areas because they don't have the communication with the world around them. And those ideas come around and they become like happen very peacefully, and things gonna become like normal very fast. Because if we are afraid of things that go, well, like when people go, oh, what will happen if, like, Russia is losing the war in Ukraine and things start going to shit, was like, we need to talk about this. We need to discuss this. I understand that I probably talked enough for 2 hours or 3 hours, I don't know. Probably a couple of hours. Yeah, started at 7, so almost 2 hours I've been talking about stuff in a very, very boring voice, not very fast, and I'm not very good in intonations. So, but we talk about this, and hopefully, people who are guilty of things that transpire in Ukraine right now, hopefully they will get punished fast, but hopefully this will not lead to an utter shitstorm, which will happen if we do not talk about this. Which will happen if people in those areas are not having those ideas discussed by those of us who can speak English, Russian, whichever, if those ideas do not filter through over the next few months. So, after nearly 2 hours, I'm gonna finish. If you lost it, or at least scrolled through this video to this point of time, thank you very much. I understand that I'm not hyper interesting, and I understand that those are serious topics and you can't really discuss them in a 15-minute video. But if you start talking about these ideas and sharing them, don't have to take mine, use yours. But if we start talking about this, so the world stops being afraid of life after Russia, because it will happen, and the best we can hope for is that it happens with far less bloodshed than is likely at the moment. So, thank you very much for your time. I hope you guys have good time. I hope this war finishes very, very soon. I hope after this war people gonna change and we're gonna see more peace and gonna have more resolving of the conflict by communication, and maybe seeing the country leaders kick each other's ass in a boxing ring or something like this. Less death and more good things coming. But I hope, I say I hope, but I know they won't, but I hope things will change. So, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for lasting so long. I wish you guys all the best. I wish you peaceful skies over your head. And I wish that wars are finished and then we can start moving forward into the